Well, we'll get right into it. Welcome back to Federal and Indian Gaming Law. Hopefully last week was good for everybody. Nice spring break. Again, the videos for the class are up online. They're on YouTube. So for anybody that wants to go back and look at prior lectures, they're somewhat redacted. So you don't have to watch an entire class period, but videos are up. Today we're going to talk about the internet, part 1. On Wednesday, we have guest lecturers from a former student, and I'm completely losing my train of thought. I'm sorry. Guest lecturers from GeoComply, and they're going to talk to you about geocompliance, location identification, and they're going to talk to you about their internship program. So hopefully that's helpful to everybody. But before we get there, we do need to talk a little bit about the internet and about the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act. You have a question?
Yes. Is Wednesday's lecture, since it's a guest lecture, going to be recorded?
I don't know. They haven't responded with the
Okay.
with whether the recording's okay. So
I don't know if anyone else is, but I'm taking the MPRE on Wednesday morning, so I won't be here.
okay.
Okay.
Well, good luck with the MPRE. Anyway, back to this. We're going to talk about the UIGEA and borders and a little bit about the internet. So as we talk about this, remember, don't forget about those elements you look for in a gambling scheme, on the variations that constitute those elements. You know, remember sort of the essence of the Federal Wire Act, you know, what it means to be in the business of betting or wagering under this act as opposed to under the Illegal Gambling Business Act. The pre-2011 interpretation, the Lombardo post-2011 interpretation, or I'm sorry, pre-2011 interpretation, the December 2011 interpretation by the DOJ, the most recent interpretation by the DOJ, and those limited exemptions with regard to the Federal Wire Act. And again, remembering the Illegal Gambling Business Act, which went too fast there, and its core is something to not forget. Remember, it's a law that helps states enforce their gambling laws for conduct that occurs in interstate commerce. So it violates the laws of any state in which it's conducted, has 5 or more people that own, manage, supervise, finance, direct, or conduct the business, and is either in continuous operation for at least 30 days or has gross revenue of at least $2,000 in a single day. So again, 2 laws to be mindful of. And again, we talked about the Travel Act and the Wagering Paraphernalia Act. Again, another federal law that assists states in enforcing their laws, which makes it, you know, the Travel Act makes it a federal crime to travel across state borders to violate gambling laws, among other laws. And the Wagering Paraphernalia Act prohibits the transportation of wagering paraphernalia to transport wagering paraphernalia in or from or to states where that paraphernalia is illegal or supports illegal gambling. And kind of keep track of, don't forget, we talked about USC 1301 and 1308 in this context. That's the cross-border sales of lottery tickets and lottery chances is a federal crime. So from those things, you can kind of see a policy developing here, hopefully. And that policy is that gambling is primarily governed by state law. Federal law, in general, assists states in enforcing criminal gambling laws when there's conduct of gambling in interstate commerce. And then with regard to sports wagering and lotteries, federal law ensures that the activity is conducted solely on an intrastate basis. So there's a policy, particularly with regard to lottery, that because lotteries is funding government, there's an inherent offensiveness to one state attempting to fund its governmental activity with revenue taken from residents of another state or outside their own state. And then with sports wagering, the thought there was to contain sports wagering to where it currently was, which was Nevada, and only allow information assisting in such wagering to occur, provided it was legal in both states. Remember the New York racing example that was in Robert Kennedy's summary of the Federal Wire Act. Now we should talk about the internet. So what is the internet? Well, depends who you ask, right? According to Merriam-Webster, it's an electronic communication network that connects computers, networks, and organizational computer facilities around the world. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, it's the large system of connected computers around the world that allow people to share information and communicate with one another. According to the Oxford Dictionary, it's a global computer network providing a variety of information and communication facilities of interconnected networks using a standardized communication protocols. For our purposes, we're going to be more towards that last definition. It's really a global interconnection of networks using common international communications protocols. That's really what it is. But what does that mean? Well, first, you have to start with a computer network. And at least according to Britannica, that means two or more computers that are connected for one or another purpose of communicating data electronically. So when you have more than one computer that's connected for the purpose of communicating and communicating data. So where does this come from? Well, let's go back in time a little bit. Originally, computers were programmed by connecting wires. Sounds archaic, and it was. Fast forward about 15, 20 years, and the terminal gets invented. But you need to connect the terminal to the computer. And again, at this time, back in the 40s and 50s, computers are huge. You know, a computer that's a fraction of the power of the computer you're using right now would take up an entire floor of a room. So to communicate, a standard was invented called RS-232 serial communications. And that allowed the terminal to communicate with the computer one bit at a time in each direction. So the terminal would send information to the computer, and then the computer would respond with information to display on the terminal. By today's standards, it was very, very slow, but it worked. But for this kind of communication to work, you really had to be in the same location. There was a limit to how long the cable could be. So something better was needed. And something that's better was needed because computers aren't often in the same room with one another, or even in the same building or same campus. But that same communications protocol was used for computers to communicate, particularly on campuses and in localities. But again, it's slow, it's done by a single cable, and the cable can't be terribly long. In the 1960s, there was a move to start connecting computers over long distances. And the way to do this was to use telephone lines. Telephone lines really couldn't carry RS-232 communications. So what was invented was something called a modem, a modulator demodulator. And what the modem did is it encoded data as sounds so they could be transmitted over telephone lines. Again, the telephone lines were built for communications, but they were built for voice communications. So they handled audio fairly well. So taking those ones and zeros and turning them into sounds allowed computers to communicate with one another, although by today's standards, it was extraordinarily slow. Let me show you a couple of videos. Show you one. This is a good advertisement from the early 80s for Hayes. In fact, the picture you have here is of a Hayes smart modem, probably from about 1982. Hopefully you can hear this. Oops.
Tuesday, transfer Christmas list to disk. Print out guest list for Muriel's wedding. Oh, I couldn't be without my computer system. How can we ever get along without them? But you know, even that is not enough nowadays. You're too confined, too isolated. There is a great big wonderful world out there and you want to link up to it. I know how. Actually, telecomputing, I call it computers talking to each other, it's really very simple. All you need is a modem. That stands for modulator, demodulator. But don't worry about that. All you need to know is that it's your computer's telephone. I like to keep things simple. That's why I prefer this one. It's a smart modem from Hayes. Look how easy it is to connect. This is the power cord. Plug this cord into any RS-232 computer, then plug the other into the telephone system. So simple. Even my sister Helen can do it. Now you can communicate with computers, databases, mail systems, time-sharing services all over America. And you don't need this. I know you've seen ads with contraptions hooked up to the telephone receiver. Those are acoustic coupler modems. Bad news. They pick up background noise that can block your computer signals. This is much better. In fact, Hayes makes the best modems for microcomputers. And that's not all. Where did I put it? Oh, Smart Comp 2. This little disk not only helps you send and receive data, you can edit it, store it, print it, and it's just so easy. The screen tells you what to do step by step. Say you want to check a stock report. Child's play. The smart modem automatically dials the number. It's especially nice if you're a little forgetful. If you run into a problem, just press one key for help. The screen explains what you need to do. Plus, the nice people at Hayes give loads of examples, so you can be up and running the first time out. Of course, when I'm not checking the market, I have some fun with my little business. I sell these, you know. Actually, my sister Helen up in Dubuque, she's my partner. And we have our whole business on computer. I send her reports late at night when the rates are low. Of course, Helen's always asleep at that time, but it's okay with the Hayes system. Her computer receives the reports all by itself and prints them and stores them to disk all at the same time. Hey, Mildred, crank out another 5,000 for Anchorage. Hayes makes modems for a lot of computers and the communication software to go with them. So check with your dealer. See how easy it is to plug into the exciting world of telecomputing. I still call it computers talking to each other.
That was an ad clearly from Hayes, but it had a lot of things in there that, don't occur anymore. I mean, first, you had that modem that connects to the computer, that connects to the phone line. And if you listen carefully, when she connected, it had a touch tone dialing system. So it would dial just as though it was a telephone. So the phone system thought it was just a telephone. And the other thing to keep in mind is she did say that she sets a timer for the transmission of her data and the receipt of her data to go off at night when rates are low. Again, this is back at the time when telephone systems were circuit switch systems, not packet switch systems, which means you had a local switchboard for your telephone. You know, in the real old days, there was an actual switchboard operator. And over time, that became automated. And that's why you have touch tone dialing, because the touch tones were easier for computers to interpret for dialing telephone numbers. And you paid for telephone service on a monthly basis. And that monthly basis included calls to other phones that were on that same switch. But if you went long distance at all, you paid extra, because what it would require is leaving that switch to communicate with another switch to communicate with a phone, or switch to switch to switch. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. But it's a good illustration of the early days of computer technology and communicating between computing systems. And computing systems did communicate via modem. There was something called the BBS, or bulletin board system. There are still a few of these around. Really, they're accessible on the internet now. But in the old days, you know, pre-2000, these bulletin board systems were set up by hobbyists, usually. And they would have a number of phone lines coming into their house, a number of modems connecting to a single computer, and anybody that was willing to call them could access information from that computer. And you were limited by the number of concurrent users based upon the number of modems and telephone lines coming into that house or that computer system. The one on the bottom left, you can see that there are a number of telephone numbers in the Washington, D.C. area for connecting to that bulletin board system. So you could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people logged in at the same time. Now, again, if you were not in the D.C. area and you wanted to connect to that system, you could, but you would pay long distance telephone charges to do so. So often bulletin board systems were located locally. Now, things like email, and you'll see, was it 1, 2, 3 down? You'll see the name Brian Driscoll, Fido. Fido was an old form of email system. So you could send an email to somebody using FidoNet by dialing up to a local bulletin board system. And at some point in the middle of the night, that local bulletin board system would send its email to a system in a nearby location. And eventually, with all these different connections, your email would get around, but it might take a while, a couple of days maybe, but it would get there eventually. On the right, we have a pretty common menu system for bulletin boards. And if you look at number 20, what you'll see is there were games available. And there were a lot of multiplayer games available on bulletin board systems, including gambling games. So this is where some of this stuff gets pioneered. And we'll show that in just a bit. Although I think I might not have included that. The gambling games, though, were primarily text or ASCII based. So you didn't have a lot of graphics. But they did exist. And this is the first time you're starting to see computers really used for online gaming. But again, it's pretty limited. You had to have a computer system. That computer system had to have a modem. And you had to have the phone number for a bulletin board system in your area, or multiple bulletin board systems in your area. Now let me put this again into context. An Apple IIe at the time was about $1,400, which in today's money, I think is around somewhere north of $4,000. That modem would set you back another $500, which again, you can multiply that by almost 4. And you're talking slightly under $2,000 for a modem. So again, hobbyists, a relatively expensive hobby, not great adoption. And again, let's talk about that phone system. So again, as I mentioned, originally, this is how the phone systems work. So you have a local area that your phone is connected to. That local switch that you're connected to is connected to a large area telephone switch, which connects multiple local area switches. And those were connected to long distance switches, which were then connected to other long distance switches. So if you wanted to make a call from, I don't know, let's say that black phone on the left to the yellow phone on the right, you'd have to go through your local switch, up to the lattice switch, down to another local switch, to that telephone, that yellow telephone. Now, that meant incurring significant cost because only those phones that were in that group on the left were included in your local telephone area. Everything else you paid extra for, and you paid extra by the minute, by the call. First minute of the call cost you the most. Every subsequent minute cost you additional amounts, and you got charged as soon as that additional minute started. So no fractional minutes, but it worked. And again, if you wanted to call from, let's say, the black phone on the left to the blue phone, you'd have to go up from one ladder, over the long distance switch, down the other one, and to the blue phone. If you wanted to call farther away, you'd have to go from long distance switch to long distance switch, again, up the chain, back down the chain. And every time you touch a switch, one of those blocks, there was an added fee. So long distance calls were extremely expensive. I don't know if anybody's ever had a long distance bill here. If you did, they generally weren't cheap. My dad was in a profession where he traveled quite a bit, and my parents' long distance bills at times could get into the thousands of dollars, which today would be incredibly expensive. But if you fly overseas and you're making phone calls, that first minute could cost you $5, $10, depending on where you are. So for computers, this doesn't work out so well because, again, that first minute is your most expensive minute. And as you saw from that video, the old lady, she said, well, I upload and download my data at night when the rates are lower. And the rates were lower at night. So communicating long distance did cost less in off-peak hours. But computer data transmissions, especially non-graphic data, doesn't take a lot of time. So with each call you make, with that first minute being your most expensive minute, computer communications were really, really expensive for its use. So a better solution needed to be invented. The other problem you had is that you couldn't have a persistent network with that old phone system, because if somebody else was on that line, somebody else was on that circuit, and you tried calling, you get a busy signal. That's no good for computer communications. Now I gotta wait. Now those old bulletin board systems, you very well may get a busy signal. And if you were fortunate enough to have a computer and a modem, you would just set your modem to continuously try that number every 30 to 40 seconds until the line opened up. You didn't pay for trying, you paid for connections. So again, a better solution is needed. solution that would use some kind of persistent networking. And that solution was packet switched communications. We'll talk about a little bit about that, but probably the best way to illustrate that is with another video or two. This is way better than me droning on about it.
When you clicked on this video, your computer sent a message to a computer at YouTube that might be states or countries or continents away. It didn't know how to get the message there, but it sent it anyway. The message probably took about half a second to arrive and told YouTube's computers to search for a file. A set of ones and zeros practically indistinguishable from the billions all around it, and to send that file back to you. YouTube's computers then sent the file back to your computer piece by piece, where those ones and zeros were interpreted as the start of this video. And the ones and zeros are still streaming in, even while you're watching me talk. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. And if you're curious how we ended up in a world where billions of computers are all interconnected through this strange structure that we call the internet, then you're in the right place. Because this is the start of a mini-series of videos about the history of the internet. From some of the first attempts at making computers work together, all the way through modern social networks and on-the-go video conferences. Developing the right combination of software, hardware, technology, and marketing took decades, so we won't be able to talk about every important engineer or invention, but we hope you'll join us as we investigate some of the crucial ideas and events along the way. People started making computers work together pretty early on. As far back as World War II, when computers were big, clunky machines that didn't do much more than solve really difficult math problems. Even with the best computers of the day, it could take months to solve just one of the complicated physics problems involved in making the atomic bomb. But a team led by physicist Richard Feynman found a way of solving a bunch of problems at once. When computers weren't being used for part of one problem, they had those computers work on a part of a different problem. So one problem might still take a month, but they could also solve 3 or 4 in the same amount of time. And for really important calculations, they used their system to simultaneously do the same problem a whole bunch of times. That way, they were sure of the final answer, even if a couple computers made a mistake along the way. Another early step came in the 1950s and 60s, when colleges started separating their computer terminals, where someone would type their program from the computers themselves. This made it easy for a lot of different people to experiment with the new machines, while keeping the circuits and tubes safely away from tinkering hands. It was almost like an early form of today's cloud computing, where a user-friendly computer sends complicated tasks to a better, less accessible computer somewhere else. Except that today's cloud uses the internet, and in 1960, there was no internet. But people were starting to think about it. The US Department of Defense had recently created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as ARPA, to keep its technology a step ahead of the Soviets. And a computer enthusiast named Joseph Licklider helped convince ARPA to fund research into a computer network connecting scientists and engineers throughout the country. A few key colleges agreed to be involved, and ARPA started building the network in 1969. They called it ARPANET. It started fairly small, as a sort of messaging service between computers at UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, Stanford University, and the University of Utah. But it was the first network of its kind. And as ARPANET grew over the next couple of decades, its engineers would add features and solve problems that still shape everything we do online. One of ARPANET's first big innovations was what's known as packet switching. You know how sometimes in old movies, when someone wants to phone a friend, they have to call a switchboard operator first? The operator was there because those phones worked by what's called circuit switching, where signals could only get from one place to another if there was a single uninterrupted circuit between them. So the operator's job was literally to plug the wire from one phone into the wire from another. Circuit switching works great if 2 places stay connected for a long time, like they might if you're making a phone call, which is why most phones still work through circuit switching, except that now the circuits move automatically instead of manually. But it would be totally impractical for the internet to work that way. Your computer would only be able to connect to one other computer at a time. And it would take extra time whenever you tried to connect somewhere else. Today, some websites might connect you to 10 different computers from around the world at the same time, all of them needing to respond immediately if you click, all the while connecting and monitoring hundreds or thousands of other visitors all at once. So circuits all over the place would constantly be flipping around, connecting somewhere for a split second before switching away and connecting somewhere else. It just wouldn't work. Even back in the 1960s, engineers knew that computers send messages far too quickly to make circuit switching practical. So instead, they invented an alternative: packet switching, where different computers send messages along the same set of wires instead of each getting one. To communicate with each other, they just send a message, called a packet, along the wires. Every packet had a kind of address label, a string of numbers representing the computer where it was headed. The computer where it started would look up the address on a table with all the addresses in the network on it, and then send the packet toward whatever nearby computer was closest to the destination. That second computer would get the packet, look up the destination address, and again, send the packet in the right direction. This process would repeat over and over until the packet finally got to where it was going. No moving circuits or wires, no one conversation at a time requirement. ARPANET used packet switching from the start, and its packets traveled over phone lines. And at first, packet switching worked exactly as planned. But there were problems over the next couple of years as dozens of new computers from around the country joined. Because the way the packet switching system was set up meant that every computer always had to keep an updated list of all the other computers' addresses. Otherwise, they'd get packets and wouldn't know where to send them. Or they'd try to send a packet somewhere that might not be around anymore. But the network kept getting bigger and bigger, and sometimes a computer's address might change if they temporarily disconnected from the network or a connection stopped working. And different computers ended up with different address books if they didn't update fast enough. So ARPANET's engineers scrapped that system and selected Stanford as the official record keeper of everyone's addresses in 1973. This quick fix let ARPANET keep growing through the 70s. With 60 computers in 1974 and over 100 by 1977. Soon, satellites connected California and Hawaii, stretching ARPANET to what had been one of the most isolated places in the world. Then, ARPANET jumped across the pond, extending the network to England and Norway. But by the mid-70s, ARPANET wasn't the only network in town. Similar networks were popping up all around the world, and some had even more computers on them. But everyone formatted their packets differently. So even though you could connect different networks together, it was a real headache. The problem was mostly solved back in 1974, but it took until the early 80s before ARPANET and most of the other networks started using it. The solution was a set of programs called TCP/IP, or Transmission Control Protocol/Internet Protocol, which we still use today. The Transmission Control Protocol was a standard way of formatting packets, so that everyone was speaking the same language. And the Internet Protocol was a standard way of assigning addresses, so there wasn't any confusion about where packets were headed. Once two networks used TCP/IP, connecting them became way easier. So all the different networks were connected to one another, forming what became known as the Internet, with ARPANET as the glue holding it all together. But with ARPANET growing so quickly and connecting to so many other networks, the record keepers at Stanford were getting overloaded. Hosts were always joining and changing addresses and trying to download the updated address book. And occasionally, the Stanford list would have errors that messed up communication throughout the whole network. And sending emails was becoming a real pain. Email was invented back in 1971. And by 1973, emails made up more than 3/4 of ARPANET's packets. But different computers had different email programs, and some required a list of every computer it would pass between sender and receiver. So people had to keep an updated map of the entire network by their desk, and they had to type out the path of their email before they could send it. And with hundreds of computers on ARPANET and over 1,000 across the internet, keeping up those maps was getting impossible. ARPANET's engineers realized that the entire structure of the internet had to be reorganized. So they came up with the domain name system, or DNS. Instead of separating each host and storing their addresses in a random order, the hosts were arranged into domains. First came the top-level domains, those .coms and .edus at the end of every website and email address. The new top-level domains meant that instead of sending an email to John@example, like you would have before DNS, you were emailing john@example.com. Then within these top level domains, each host was called a second level domain. So MIT.edu, for example, now meant the second level domain MIT with the top level domain .edu. The domain structure organized all those different hosts from all around the world in a way that computers could handle. Then DNS added a whole new network to the internet whose whole job was to keep track of addresses and connections. One computer on the new network effectively stored all addresses within the .com top level domain. Another got all the .edus, another got all the .orgs, and so on. Then other new computers collectively mapped out the entire network. So when you wanted to send an email, you didn't have to check your map and plan out all of the connections yourself. That became the DNS's job, and it's still the DNS's job today. It's why your computer didn't know how to get a message to YouTube when you clicked on this video. It basically just told the DNS server that it had something for the domain YouTube within the top level domain .com, and the DNS server did the rest. By the late 1980s, the Department of Defense realized that it had long since accomplished its goal. Originally, they just wanted a few reliable, interconnected computers, but they ended up serving as a backbone of a global network of thousands of universities, companies, governments, all talking to each other. So they decided to end the ARPANET project, and they needed to find someone to take over all those wires. Someone to run the internet. But who could be trusted with all that power? And could the internet, this huge, complicated system, become accessible to the general public? These were the big questions plaguing the internet in 1989. And that's where we'll pick up in the next episode of this series. In the meantime, thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, which...
So we'll pick it up with the next.
When you click...
Oops. Like I said, we'll pick it up with the next piece here. And this, I think, only takes another 5 minutes. But again, I think it explains it concisely, and you don't have to listen to me
If you have a smartphone, you probably have access to the internet almost everywhere you go. And being able to access what is basically the sum total of human knowledge whenever you want, that's a new thing. Pretty cool. Last year, the United Nations actually declared uncensored internet access a human right that deserves protection. But it actually took a long time for the internet to become publicly accessible at all, even in the country where it started. The internet grew from 4 computers in the Western US in 1969 to a global network of networks connecting more than 20,000 computers by the end of 1987. But it was still restricted to specific universities and corporations, which used it for specific types of collaboration and research. So how did we get from 20,000 computers on guarded networks in 1987 to the fundamental human right to internet access just 30 years later? In other words, when did the regular Joes start logging on? Some of the first tastes of the future came in the 1970s when a few companies started selling access to the networks. They were standalone networks that weren't connected to the main central network that was the internet, but their users could do everything from sending emails to checking updated weather reports to playing games and chatting on some of the first ever instant messaging programs. And on some networks, like CompuServe's Micronet, users could even read stories from major newspapers right on their home computer. Like, imagine a newspaper on your computer. But as great as these networks were, they still had their limits. Some of them, like Micronet, were only available nights and weekends when businesses that normally used CompuServe's networks were closed. And they were all pretty much isolated islands, since they weren't directly connected to each other or to the broader internet. Because throughout the 80s, no matter how big these private networks got, they weren't allowed on the internet. ARPANET and the other networks that formed the basis of the internet were government run and government funded. So the businesses and universities using them weren't allowed to have any commercial traffic on the network. It was fine to use the internet to download some data or email your colleagues a copy of your latest paper, but you weren't supposed to advertise a new product on there, and you definitely weren't supposed to charge the general public to come online. The internet was supposed to be for research, not for making money, which is pretty weird to think about, considering how many of us use the internet these days to make a living. Around the same time, ARPANET's administrators were looking to hand off responsibility for maintaining the internet. ARPANET had long since accomplished its goals, and the Department of Defense wanted to move on. The National Science Foundation's huge network, NSFNet, seemed to be the best candidate. It started in 1986 and grew so quickly after connecting to ARPANET that less than a year later, it already needed major upgrades to handle all the new traffic. In 1990, NSFNet officially replaced ARPANET as the backbone of the internet and its more than 500,000 users. But even before ARPANET was completely out of the picture, a couple enterprising companies were connecting regular people to the internet, though there's some debate about which company was there first and when. NSFNet also had a policy about banning commercial traffic on the network, but in 1988 they decided to try connecting a couple of those private networks' email servers to NSFNet. And a year later, users of CompuServe and an email service called MCI Mail could send the first commercial emails across the internet. So next year, 1989, we got the first internet service providers, or ISPs. These were companies that usually didn't have any network of their own. They just connected people to a local network and to the internet. You'll hear a lot of people say that the first commercial ISP was a company called The World, which opened near Boston in December 1989. But others say the first one was down in Australia instead. And then there are people who tell you that there weren't any true internet service providers until Congress passed a law in 1992 allowing for commercial traffic on NSFNet. The truth is, of course, that lots of different companies opened their doors, or like their wires, between 1989 and 1992, but all of them offered slightly different services. Some were just email, some were their own networks that were partly connected to the internet, and some offered internet access without an online community of their own. So in this situation, different companies can all kind of claim that they were the first. More ISPs were created in the next few years, and in 1995, NSFNet shut down for good and handed everything over to the ISPs. But even in the early 1990s, the internet was nothing like it is today. For one thing, of course, it was so slow. Like downloading a picture of Captain Picard took like half the day. Not that I know that from experience. To connect to the network, your computer placed a phone call to the network through a modem, which translated between the digital signals being used in computers and the analog signals used in landline phones. Then your computer would talk to the other computers on the network using the phone lines between them. This way of getting online became known as dial-up. And if you've ever used a dial-up internet connection, you know exactly how frustratingly slow it could be. Though, to be clear, when we were first doing it, it did not seem slow, it seemed like magic. And since phone lines already crisscrossed the United States when ARPANET was invented, it just made sense to use them instead of trying to invent something completely new. Part of why dial-up was so slow is that there's a limit to how quickly you can cram information down a phone line. To transmit a lot of information, you need a signal with a really high frequency, meaning it can change very quickly. And for a signal sent down phone lines, that would mean you would need a really high-pitched sound. But phone lines weren't designed for that sort of signal. They were designed for phone calls. And even though new parents might disagree, humans just don't make sounds that are that high pitched. So phone lines weren't designed to transmit signals with very high frequencies that you would need to transmit a lot of information all at once. The first thing a modem did when it connected to a network was to check the highest frequency signal that the wires could handle. And then it slowed the fire hose of ones and zeros coming out of your computer down to that speed. There's another reason why the internet was different back when the first ISPs were popping up. Back in 1989, there wasn't a single website, because back in 1989, there was no such thing as the web. Today, a lot of people use the terms internet and web pretty much interchangeably, but they're actually different things. The internet came more than a decade before the web. Internet is a shortened form of the word internetworking, and it was coined in the 70s to refer to the physical cables and computers connecting all together. Today, it usually refers more specifically to all the computers running programs that let them communicate with each other across the giant internet network. The internet began with networks that were designed as a way of remotely sharing programs, files, and access to computers. Then programs like email were added over time. But these programs tended to organize the information a bit like a tree or even like a whole forest. To get to a specific branch of a program or file, you had to climb all the way up the trunk and then down a whole bunch of branches. And then to get somewhere else, you had to go all the way back to the trunk and over to another set of branches. When the internet was small, it never took too long to get back to where you started from so you could go somewhere else. But as the internet grew, it got harder and harder to navigate unless you knew exactly where you were going. Even smaller individual networks like the one at CERN in Europe were getting out of hand. It was a pain to find everything you needed on the network, especially if you didn't know exactly where to find the thing you were looking for, so you wasted a bunch of time navigating all those different trees. So in 1989, a scientist named Tim Berners-Lee, with some help from his colleague Robert Caillou, started working on a better way to arrange all that information. Berners-Lee is often credited with inventing the web, and for good reason. He had this big idea to sort of flatten the tree's structure. Instead of each file being like its own little isolated branch, any document or file could direct people to other related files so that they could easily go from one to the next. And he knew exactly the perfect tool for the task: hypertext. Hypertext was invented back in the 60s as a way of going directly from one part of a document to another, like skipping straight from the table of contents to chapter 10 without scrolling all the way there. Then people started using it to link between different documents, and it was incorporated into all kinds of programs throughout the 80s. Berners-Lee made the hypertext concept the primary way of navigating what he started calling the World Wide Web, with hyperlinks connecting different web pages. The web was a hit at CERN, and when it was made public in 1993, the final major piece of today's internet was in place. Tim Berners-Lee is the reason most websites you go to have addresses that start with http://www. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, the set of programs used to read documents with hyperlinks. Sometimes you'll see HTTPS, which is just a more secure version of those programs. The : is a way of introducing what comes next, and the www says that the page is part of the World Wide Web. Soon, a whole bunch of different programs popped up for accessing these new hyperlinked web pages, each interpreting and presenting them slightly differently depending on what their users wanted. These were the early web browsers, the ancestors of whatever you're using today to watch this video. Like Netscape Navigator. Remember Netscape? It was first released in 1994, and the code for it was eventually incorporated into Firefox. With the web and the internet finally paired up and publicly accessible, the number of computers using the internet exploded in the 90s, and billions of dollars were poured into startup companies on the internet throughout the decade. Wealthy investors piled cash on companies like eToys.com and GovWorks and WorldCom. Most of these startups went bankrupt around the turn of the millennium when the dot-com bubble burst and giant corporations like Google and Facebook rose from the ashes. So we'll have to wait until the next episode of this series to talk about why and how the internet went from a graveyard of failed startups to the place it is today, which is, more than just a graveyard of failed startups. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, which was brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. If you want to help support this show, you can go to patreon.com/SciShow. And
again, I think it's a pretty good explanation of the internet, how it works in a very high level, and how we got to where we are. Now, that persistent network that is the internet, using those common protocols, allows for a vast array of applications. He talked about email and hypertext, but it also allows for things like games and gaming applications, including things like slot machine applications. But there's tension, right? And the tension is that you have this global connection or interconnection of networks, all using the same protocols. As the first presenter mentioned, you could be connecting to more than a dozen computers all over the world, all at the same time. But that's not how laws work. Laws are inherently geographic. Nevada has, a state law regarding gambling. The United States federal government has laws regarding gambling. Some municipalities have laws regarding gambling. But again, they're all contained by geography, by political geography. So you do have a lot of tension between borders, laws, communications, and the availability of services like gambling services. Enter the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act to try and help the United States at least enforce its laws regarding gambling in this kind of environment. So the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act was a law that had been a bill that had been bounced around Congress for years before it became enacted. The bill every year died an untimely death, in part because it made banks the first line of enforcement, and banks didn't want to be the first line of enforcement. for anything. They're not enforcers, they're banks. But it kept failing until 2006. Now in 2006, we had an off-year election. So it wasn't a presidential year election, off-year election. We had one-party government at the federal level. So you had one party that was the majority in both the Senate and the House and occupied the White House. And that party had a bit of a problem with corruption. And to deal with that, they came out with an American values agenda. And part of that American values agenda was to do something about online gambling. And the bill comes up in the last day of the 2006 legislative session. And it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't get enacted. And at the time, the Senate Majority Leader was a man named Bill Frist, who was widely thought to be the front runner for his party's nomination for president in the upcoming 2008 elections. Again, that election cycle hadn't started. We were just finishing up the 2006 election cycle. And he really, really wanted to make good on this American values agenda. And he went around looking for somebody to carry it, and he just couldn't find anybody to carry the bill on this last day until he found a congressman from northern Wisconsin that was willing to put it on something called the Safe Port Act. And at this point in time, for whatever reason, Congress was very enamored with using acronyms to title bills. And the Safe Port Act was actually an acronym for something I can't remember. But the gist of the bill was, the primary purpose of the bill was to require ports to install fissile detection equipment and to run them through that equipment to prevent a dirty bomb or an atomic explosive from going off on US soil or damaging US ports. Now again, this is 2006. You're 5 years removed from 2011. It's in October. So really it's 5 years and 1 month removed from 9/11. It's an anti-terrorism bill. It comes up after midnight. And as soon as this session's over, Congress is going to go home to campaign. Everybody in the House goes home to campaign. A third of the Senate goes home to campaign. And it gets tacked on sometime after midnight, and it gets passed. And I'm not sure anybody read it. Anybody ever do any research on Thomas.gov? It's the congressional website, legislative website. You can see all the bills that are being considered. The UIGEA wasn't tacked onto the Safe Port Act on Thomas until well after it was enacted by Congress. It's because it came up so late, it didn't make it. But what does it do? Well, the first thing it does is that it says that it doesn't alter, limit, or extend any federal, state, or tribal state compact prohibiting, permitting, or regulating gambling in the United States. That's an important piece. And again, something else you'll notice, we looked at the Federal Wire Act, that was 18 USC 1084. We looked at the Illegal Gambling Business Act, that was 18 USC 1955. And the Travel Act, and the Wagering Paraphernalia Act, and those statutes regarding lotteries, 18 USC 1301 through 1308. This is Title 31. This is 31 USC, and that should give you a tip off that things are a little different with this act. It is not a criminal gambling statute. It is not an 18 USC criminal gambling statute. It's in Title 31. Anybody else know what else is in Title 31? Courtney.
This is just a guess based on what you said the bill was about, but I think like Department of Defense, like nuclear warfare provisions.
No, but that's a great guess. It is a good guess. Title 31 is where we have banking regulations, banking laws, anti-money laundering laws. And that's what this is. It is not a criminal gambling statute. It is a funds transfer statute. So what does it actually do? First, it doesn't alter other federal, state, or tribal state compacts. Federal laws, state laws, tribal state compacts remain the same. So if it doesn't change the nature of any activity to being or not being gambling, what does it do? Well, I guess the first question is, reading that, do you think it makes online poker illegal? No, it doesn't. Relies on other laws. So what does it do? Well, I accidentally deleted one of the slides last night. What it does is it prohibits the transfer of funds in furtherance of illegal gambling. So what does that mean? It means it prohibits the transfer of funds for activities that are illegal online gambling under other statutes. So it's kind of like a piling on law. But that's what it prohibits. I can't believe I deleted that slide. There are a number of exemptions. So you have an exemption for securities trading. Might be deemed gambling under other state laws. And in fact, in some states, there are still laws in the books that prohibit certain forms of securities trading. Why is this exempted? Because the SEC is supposed to regulate that. It exempts indemnity agreements, insurance contracts. Anybody know what an indemnity agreement is? No guess? Courtney?
It's like insurance in a way. It's like you pool money, I think, to, I don't know, like you indemnify and hold harmless companies. I'm not explaining it well.
No, that's good. I mean, one of the examples I've seen is for professional athlete bonuses. So you're the Dallas Cowboys, you've got a top receiver, or better yet, you're the Las Vegas Raiders. You just picked up Devontae Adams, and he's got a very large contract, but he also has lots of incentives in that contract that can make the contract much more expensive for the team. Now, the base salary, you can't really manage that risk or lay off that risk. But what about the bonuses? So if there's a bonus in there, if he catches more than 2,000 yards of footballs, gets more than 2,000 yards in the season, maybe gets another $5 million bonus. Now, what a team like the Raiders might do is look for a company that will enter into an indemnity agreement with them, that if that happens, they'll pay X portion of that. And they'll do that for an upfront fee. And it is a lot like insurance. It works just like insurance, but they're technically not insurance contracts. But it works the same way. But in most states, to be an insurance contract, you have to meet certain criteria. You have to be a licensed insurer. There are only certain things that you can insure against. So these fall outside that. That would be an indemnity agreement. Insurance contracts. Does an insurance contract sort of have the same components as a gambling event? I mean, the insured usually pays a fee up front, so there's consideration. There's an event that is not within the insured's control. And if that event is realized, then the insurer will pay a sum. You think about even car insurance. You pay your car insurance for a 6-month period. If you have a car accident, the insurer pays you. If you don't, they don't. And in theory, that accident is outside your control. You know, nobody goes out and smashes a car up intentionally unless they're renting a Tesla that they want to see if it can fly. If anybody's seen that video. But yeah, insurance has those same components. Free entry contests. And again, we've talked about that consideration, chance, and prize, and how in some jurisdictions you have promoter benefit laws, or any consideration or contract consideration, even if it's free, truly free. Those don't fall under here. Now that, again, going back to that rule of construction, does that mean that the UIGEA now makes those things legal? Does it preempt state law and make them legal? Get a chat. Correct. It doesn't. It just means that you won't be piling on the UIGEA on top of it. Same thing with certain fantasy sports contests. Those are exempted as well. We get to sports, we'll talk more about that. We have a fantasy class as well. So again, it has another definition of being in the business of betting or wagering, but it's a negative definition. It just says that being in the business of betting or wagering doesn't include the financial transaction provider and any basically an ISP, interactive computer service or telecommunication service. So they don't want banks, phone companies, ISPs, cable companies to be deemed to be in the business of betting or wagering. Remember the In-Ray MasterCard case, trying to get the credit card companies, i.e. the financial transaction provider, roped into this? At least under the UIGEA, no, they're out. What does an unlawful internet wager or internet gambling mean? It means to place, receive, or otherwise knowingly transmit a bet or wager by any means which involves at least in part the internet, where such bet or wager is unlawful under any applicable federal or state law in the state or tribal lands in which the bet or wager is initiated, received, or otherwise made. So you have to look to other laws to see if the transaction, if the activity, the underlying activity is illegal gambling or unlawful internet gambling. Again, more exemptions. Intrastate wagers are exempted, provided there is appropriate data security and age verification. So for those of you that have sports betting apps with, you know, William Hill or Wynn or MGM or Caesars or Boyd or Stations, those are exempted because we do proper age verification and have data security. Intra-tribal transactions and horse racing in compliance with the Interstate Horse Racing Act, which we'll talk about in another class as well. So what's the real operative language? Well, no person engaged in the business of betting or wagering may knowingly accept, in connection with the participation of another person in unlawful internet gambling, basically anything of value. There's a nice laundry list: cash, money, ACH, credit, credit card. It's a really long list, and it really means anything of value. And, whoops, it requires the Federal Reserve to issue, or the Department of Treasury to issue regulations applicable to banks to identify and stop those transactions. This is why the banks were not real happy with this. Now, by the way, what happens to banks, a year and a half after this? Anybody remember? So this passes in October of 2006, gets signed into law. Year and a half after October 6th, you're into 2008. Anybody know what happens to banks in 2008?
They get a lot of money back that they lost.
Some do, and some go under. You had the credit default swap issue. Anybody familiar with those? In a nutshell, and this is really oversimplifying it, banks have to have certain reserves to stay solvent. What banks could do, so yeah, you have to have certain, if banks make money by issuing loans and giving loan-based products, credit cards, things like that, and charging fees. But you can only give away so many loans because you need to keep some amount in reserve to make sure you stay solvent, particularly if those loans go bad. And what banks did to get around this is something called the credit default swap, which is like a form of insurance. So if the loan went bad, the insurer would make good on it. And it was originally designed for short-term business-to-business loans. So, and it worked in that context. But then it started to be used for mortgages, which then incentivized some banks to issue subprime mortgages because, hey, it's like free money, right? As long as we're insured, we don't have to keep that reserve requirement. The insurance will suffice. And lo and behold, what happened is you get a number of defaults. A lot of banks went under. The economy collapsed. There was a news article, I think it was in the RJ, it might have been in another paper, that the loss in land value alone in Nevada in 2008, between the beginning of 2007 and the end of 2008 was equivalent to the federal budget of 1963 or something like that. It's crazy. But banks are not in great shape after this law is passed, and it took a while for the regulations to be put in place. And again, unlawful internet gambling under the regs mirrors the statute. And the other provisions are the regulations require financial institutions to identify and block these transactions. And if they do, there's no liability for them. If they don't, then there is. If they block transactions that are legitimate, but they're trying to comply with this act, there's no liability for that either. So banks will err on the side of blocking these transactions. And it's a lot of information in a really short period of time. So what does the UIGEA prohibit? Prohibits funds transfers that further online gambling when that online gambling operates in violation of any federal law, state law, or tribal state compact, unless it's exempted under this statute, in which case the activity still isn't legal, but you won't face an additional criminal charge for the funds transfers associated with it. Doesn't make online casino wagering illegal. No. Doesn't make skill gaming illegal. Again, it doesn't touch the underlying character of the event. That's legality of that event is determined under other laws. For example, there is a state that prohibits fantasy sports conducted online or via telephone. The fantasy sports sites still offer fantasy sports in that jurisdiction, claiming that the UIGEA preempts state law. It expressly doesn't preempt state law. So we'll get to that when we talk about fantasy. But I do note that we're pretty much up against the clock. Do you have questions? We went through a lot in a short period of time.